Everyone remembers 9/11, the horrific terrorist attack in 2001 that killed thousands and reshaped American policy. It was devastating, but it could have been worse. Suppose Al Qaeda bombed Washington, bombed the White House, killed the president, and installed a brutal military dictatorship which drove the economy into the worst disaster in its history. That's no fictional scenario. It's exactly what happened to Chile on September 11, 1973. Only it wasn't Al Qaeda spreading jihad against Western imperialism. It was the United States spreading democracy to combat communism during the Cold War. This so-called democracy unleashed devastation, its horrors sparking a global reckoning over human rights. But was the destruction of 40,000 lives, the killings, torture, and imprisonments worth defeating the communist threat? The coup in Chile reveals the corrupt grip of big corporations and exposes the true purpose of the Cold War. Mid-20th century Chile was a nation caught in the grip of vast inequality and social unrest. By the 1930s, Chile was one of the most economically unequal countries in Latin America. Despite its wealth of natural resources, particularly copper, the majority of Chileans lived in poverty, working in mines, farms, and factories owned by a small elite or foreign corporations. Politically, the country was marked by instability, with frequent shifts in government and growing discontent among workers and peasants demanding reform. During these turbulent times, Salvador Allende came of age. While studying medicine at the University of Chile, he saw firsthand the impact of poverty and inequality on public health, igniting his lifelong commitment to social justice and led him into politics. In 1933, as Chile's economic struggles deepened during the Great Depression, Allende co-founded the Socialist Party of Chile. In the 1940s, Allende's career gained momentum, but it also courted controversy. He served as Minister of Health in a Popular Front government, which championed workers' rights and public health initiatives. Meanwhile, Chile's political system remained polarized, with conservatives clashing with a growing leftist movement, and the centrist Christian Democrats emerging as a powerful force. Allende entered the national stage as a senator in 1945, representing the Socialist Party. Over the next 2 decades, he became a leading voice for land reform, nationalization of natural resources, and workers' rights, often directly challenging the foreign corporations that dominated Chile's economy, especially in the copper industry. These corporations, backed by the United States, reaped massive profits while Chileans struggled to make ends meet, a dynamic that became central to Allende's political narrative. By the 1950s and 1960s, calls for reform were growing louder. Rural farmers demanded land redistribution, miners called for better wages, and urban workers fought for labor rights. Allende ran for president in 1952, 1958, and 1964, each time building more support for Chile's working class and intellectuals. His 1958 campaign was especially significant, as he came within a fraction of a percent of victory. However, his 1964 defeat was a sobering reminder of Cold War realities. The United States feared the rise of another socialist government in Latin America after the disaster in Cuba with Fidel Castro. So they funneled significant funding to Allende's Christian Democrat opponent, who positioned himself as a moderate reformer. By 1970, Chile's economy was stagnant, inequality was worsening, and frustrations with centrist policies were boiling over. Allende seized this moment with his fourth presidential campaign, representing the Popular Unity Coalition, a broad alliance of socialists, communists, and other leftist groups. His message struck a chord with millions of Chileans who felt left behind by the existing system. In a historic victory, Allende won the presidency in September 1970 with 36.3% of the vote, becoming the world's first democratically elected Marxist leader. Salvador Allende's vision, known as the Chilean Way to Socialism, aimed to transform Chile into a more equitable society through peaceful and democratic means. Central to his agenda was the nationalization of key industries, particularly copper, which was dominated by American corporations. Copper accounted for the majority of Chile's export revenue, but the wealth it generated primarily benefited the foreign companies and small elite. Beyond copper, Allende threatened to nationalize banks and other strategic sectors, aiming to give the state greater control over the economy. Part of his plan was launching an ambitious agrarian reform program, redistributing millions of acres of land to impoverished farmers. This policy would seek to address the deep inequalities in rural Chile, where a few wealthy landowners controlled vast estates while peasants worked for subsistence wages. Additionally, Allende planned to expand social programs, including free milk for children and increasing workers' wages. These reforms were popular among Chile's working class and rural poor, but deeply alarmed the country's business elite and conservative politicians. More critically, they enraged American companies like Anaconda and Kennecott, which had reaped enormous profits from Chile's copper industry. These corporations immediately lobbied the Nixon administration to block Allende's inauguration. National Security Advisor Henry Kissinger, as revealed in a memorandum he authored, viewed Allende's presidency as a dual threat, endangering not only U.S. economic interests but also their ideological dominance. Allende's success would undermine the narrative that socialism was incompatible with democracy, offering a blueprint for other nations in Latin America and beyond to follow, potentially triggering a domino effect. Kissinger intensified pressure on President Richard Nixon to take action. By that time, the United States had a history of foreign interventions during the Cold War, beginning with the 1953 coup against Iran's Prime Minister Mossadegh after he nationalized the oil industry. Bolstered by their perceived success, such covert operations had become a cornerstone of American foreign policy. Since Allende lacked a clear popular majority, his election required confirmation by the Chilean Congress. This provided the CIA with an opening to pursue what seemed the simplest and least destructive coup strategy, pressuring Chilean lawmakers to deny Allende the presidency and rally behind a coalition candidate instead. However, the CIA's efforts to bribe, coerce, and blackmail Chile's Congress and military met resistance, particularly from General René Schneider, the commander-in-chief of the Chilean army. Despite being a conservative, Schneider was a steadfast defender of Chile's constitutional tradition, which mandated military non-intervention in politics. To the CIA, he was an obstacle. The agency provided financial and logistical support, including weapons, to right-wing factions to deal with Schneider. On October 22nd, the general was ambushed and shot, succumbing to his injuries 3 days later. The CIA later claimed they had only intended for the conspirators to kidnap him, and we'll have to take their word for it. The assassination shocked Chile and deepened political tensions. But instead of preventing Allende's presidency, it strengthened support for him. The mostly conservative body ultimately decided to confirm Allende's election on October 24th, after he promised support of 10 libertarian constitutional amendments. The new president wasted no time implementing the sweeping reforms he had promised during his campaign. This infuriated Nixon. He famously instructed his officials to make the economy scream, and so they did. One of the primary tools was cutting off financial lifelines. The United States pressured international institutions like the IMF, the World Bank, and private banks to deny Chile's loans, even for essential projects. This economic isolation made it nearly impossible for Allende's government to address the nation's growing fiscal challenges. Meanwhile, American copper companies coordinated with Washington to freeze Chilean assets abroad. With foreign investment drying up and export revenue dwindling, inflation spiraled out of control, causing widespread shortages of basic goods. At the same time, the United States funneled millions of dollars to opposition groups within Chile to create chaos and resistance. Anti-Allende propaganda was a critical weapon in this campaign. The CIA funded newspapers like El Mercurio and other media outlets to spread disinformation, stoke fear about socialism, and amplify every failure of Allende's government. These outlets portrayed the economic hardships not as a result of U.S. sabotage but as the inevitable outcome of Allende's socialist policies, further polarizing the Chilean public. The sabotage extended to mobilizing key sectors of the economy. The CIA covertly supported strikes, including a devastating trucker strike that paralyzed transportation and disrupted food and supply chains. The financial blockade and strikes eroded Allende's support among the middle class while rallying conservative elites against him. The economic suffocation continued until 1973. That year, Augusto Pinochet was appointed as commander-in-chief of the army. Born in 1915 to a modest family, Pinochet pursued a career in the military, climbing the ranks with a reputation for discipline and loyalty. Yet his ambition was undeniable, and he worked tirelessly to position himself within the army's upper echelons. In the 1940s, as a junior officer, Pinochet had an early encounter with Salvador Allende, who was then a doctor and an emerging political figure. During a heated argument, Pinochet reportedly threatened to shoot Allende, a moment neither could have foreseen would foreshadow their deeply intertwined fates. Over the years, Pinochet developed a knack for keeping a low profile. He earned trust without drawing too much attention. Unassuming might be the best word to describe him, but beneath his stoic exterior lay a calculating opportunist. The Chilean military by then had become a key player in the unfolding coup. The United States, through the CIA, systematically cultivated discontent within the ranks of Chile's armed forces. High-ranking generals were bribed, encouraged, and assured of America's support should they move against Allende. Pinochet's ability to remain apolitical and avoid the ideological battles within the military ultimately worked to his advantage. Allende promoted him to a high-ranking position, believing he was merely a professional soldier, not a political operator. By early September, conspirators within the military were finalizing their plans to overthrow Allende. While figures like General Gustavo Ley of the Air Force had been openly critical of the president for months, Pinochet maintained his facade of loyalty. As late as September 8th, he gave no indication of his involvement, even assuring Allende that the military would not act against the constitution. This deception lulled Allende into a false sense of security, preventing him from taking preemptive action against the plotters. Meanwhile, the CIA continued its role as a silent partner, providing intelligence and resources while ensuring the operation remained covert to avoid direct US culpability. In the early hours of September 11, 1973, darkness cloaked Santiago as the city braced for an event that would forever alter its course. Military units moved swiftly to seize control of key locations. Radio stations fell silent or broadcast the junta's message, cutting off any chance for the government to rally its supporters. Government offices were stormed, their occupants ousted or arrested. When President Allende became fully aware of the betrayal unfolding around him, he retreated to La Moneda Palace, the presidential stronghold. Inside, a small band of loyalists joined him. As dawn broke, the palace was encircled. Tanks and troops surrounded its walls. Foreseeing his fate, Allende addressed the nation over the airwaves in what would become his final speech.
Sabiendo que mucho más temprano que tarde, de nuevo abrirán las grandes alamedas por donde pase el hombre libre para construir una sociedad mejor. ¡Viva Chile! ¡Viva el pueblo! ¡Vivan los trabajadores! Estas son mis últimas palabras y tengo la certeza de que mi sacrificio no será en vano. Tengo la certeza de que por lo menos será una lección moral que castigará la felonía, la cobardía y la traición.
Outside, Augusto Pinochet, once his trusted military leader, coordinated the assault with precision. He left no room for negotiation, no path for retreat, ensuring the coup would succeed at all costs. By mid-morning, the city trembled as fighter jets screamed through the skies. Their bombs fell with devastating accuracy, striking La Moneda and engulfing the palace in smoke and fire. Inside, chaos reigned as the walls shook and flames consumed the building. Allende refused multiple offers of safe passage, rejecting any suggestion of exile. "I will not resign," he declared. "I will not flee." He donned a helmet and held his rifle, reportedly a gift from Fidel Castro, as he prepared for his final stand. The military breached the palace by midday. Gunfire erupted in the corridors, echoing through the smoke-filled halls as the last of Allende's loyalists fell. Refusing to be captured by those who had betrayed him and his people, Allende reportedly took his own life in a final act of defiance. Thus ended the life of the first democratically elected socialist leader. Augusto Pinochet swiftly installed himself as Chile's new ruler following the coup, bringing Salvador Allende's socialist experiment to an abrupt end. Allende's government had sought to radically reshape Chile, but by 1973 the nation was in economic turmoil, with wages plummeting by 35% and inflation soaring to nearly 700%. Stepping into power, Pinochet promised to restore order and reverse the catastrophic economic conditions that had left the country on the brink of collapse. Key to Pinochet's economic transformation were the Chicago Boys, a group of Chilean economists trained at the University of Chicago under Milton Friedman. They seized the coup as a golden opportunity to implement their radical free market ideology. With Pinochet's full backing, they dismantled the existing economic framework, slashing tariffs, privatizing state industries, and eliminating regulations. Public services, once central to Allende's socialist policies, were gutted, leaving citizens to navigate an unregulated marketplace. The promises of efficiency and growth replaced social safety nets, ushering in a stark economic overhaul. These neoliberal reforms delighted American corporations like ITT and the copper giants, which had lobbied heavily for Allende's downfall. The removal of trade barriers and the privatization of industries turned Chile into a haven for foreign investors, who reaped enormous profits. In the short term, the economy appeared to stabilize. GDP rose, foreign investments surged, and exports boomed. Yet these gains came at a steep cost. Wealth inequality soared, with the benefits of growth concentrated among the elite. The fragile middle class, stripped of protections, struggled to survive, while the working class faced rising unemployment as state industries shed jobs. By the late 1970s, unemployment had exceeded 20%, fueling widespread discontent. Pinochet's response to the social unrest was brutal. His dictatorship systematically targeted dissent, executing high-ranking military officers and political officials loyal to Allende. Concentration camps were set up to detain suspected opponents, and torture became a tool of state. At the still awful but relatively normal end of the spectrum, prisoners were suffocated to the point of death and then revived. At the more depraved extremes, teenage daughters of regime critics were abducted and used as practice subjects for soldiers learning electroshock torture. In the most deranged acts, female prisoners were forced to engage in intercourse with animals while guards watched and laughed. Thousands of Chileans disappeared, their fates unknown, leaving families in anguished uncertainty. In November 1975, Pinochet's secret police, the DINA, escalated the reign of terror through Operation Condor, a collaboration with the dictatorships of Brazil, Paraguay, Uruguay, and later Argentina. This transnational campaign sought to eliminate leftist opposition across the continent. The DINA coordinated with Condor allies, sharing intelligence that enabled disappearances and assassinations. For the estimated 60,000 victims of Operation Condor, death often came in unspeakable ways: drowning in remote lakes, execution in hidden mass graves, or vanishing without a trace. Pinochet's human rights abuses shocked the world, sparking global condemnation. Chile became a haunting symbol of Cold War brutality, where economic reform and geopolitical strategy were pursued at the expense of basic human dignity. As Henry Kissinger candidly remarked to President Nixon days after the overthrow of Salvador Allende, in the Eisenhower period, we would be heroes, lamenting that their Cold War triumph would go uncelebrated by the press. To them, Pinochet's Chile was a victory, a testament to the belief that capitalism could crush socialism. The coup validated a United States doctrine that dictatorships aligned with American economic and geopolitical interests were not only tolerable, but desirable. This blueprint for intervention became a hallmark of U.S. foreign policy, leaving a trail of shattered nations in its wake. In the decades that followed, Pinochet's neoliberal experiment revealed its true face. While Chile achieved sustainable economic growth, the fruits of this so-called miracle were hoarded by the elite, leaving deep scars on the nation's social fabric. Wealth inequality became an enduring curse, with the poor and middle class condemned to struggle in a system built to exploit them. By 2019, the illusion of progress shattered as millions of Chileans took to the streets in rage. And yet, despite the torture chambers, the mass graves, and the lives obliterated under his regime, Pinochet remains a polarizing figure. To some, he's a savior who rescued Chile from the chaos of Allende's socialism. To others, he is a tyrant who sold his country's soul for power and profit. The legacy of the 1973 coup stands as a stark reminder of the price paid for U.S. ambitions, a lesson in how far nations will go to preserve their interests, even if it means leaving humanity itself as collateral damage.